Hey guys, I'm gonna just turn the mic over to Professor Robert Smith.
I'm just going to say to a question earlier, as somebody who's lived through like 5 golden ages of radio, the nice thing about a golden age is there's not just one of them. You'd think there would only be one, but you would be wrong because people love to be like, it's the 2nd golden age of podcasting. It's the 5th golden age of podcasting. So may you all have many, many golden ages to come. Oh yeah, bravo. I'm Robert Smith. I'm a professor here of audio at Columbia. I also host Planet Money occasionally still. And I'm just excited that people are now coming out to events that are about the business of podcasting. Because for many years, basically a lot of us would show up when they were like, oh, how to use binaural recordings, in Swamp recordings. And you'd be like, oh yeah, it's so great. And then, unfortunately, I've met a lot of people recently who knew nothing about the economics of their own shows until a boss came to them and said, oh, we're no longer doing your show. And they're like, wait, why? And then all of a sudden they saw the numbers for the show. And that should never happen. And so one of my missions going forward is just like, we need to talk about this stuff. If you're in radio, I don't care if you just want to just record poetry, in the woods, you need to know things about listeners and how those shows are paid for and how to market and sell those shows. So one of the reasons we're here today is 10 years since Serial. And of course, Serial changed everything for those of us in podcasting, those of us who wanted to be podcasters. But we haven't mentioned yet an important part of Serial. Support from Serial comes from MailChimp. MailChimp. MailChimp.
Like draw blood for am I the only person in the room who would like do a sacrifice to see the details of that MailChimp ad contract? I would love to see those numbers.
So I do know that they were expecting 300,000 people to listen to Serial. And so they made a deal. MailChimp was the sole sponsor of this show. The actual listenership is 100 times that, if not 200 times that now, in the tens of millions. Maybe it's even reached 100 million. It was the greatest podcasting deal of all time, which was amazing. But what it meant is that there was a little bit of a gold rush that happened after that in podcasting, where companies were like, I want to find the next Serial. I want to be the next MailChimp. I want to have this opportunity to like have this marketing hit. And things were great for years and years and years and years. And then recently, things have changed a little bit. And we found, I know, something happened. The money didn't go away. The money in podcasting continues to go up. The audience didn't go away. The audience still grows. But the distribution of the money started to feel different. I knew people whose shows were eliminated. I know people who went months without having ad sales in their podcasts. And the podcasts that did have ads somehow started to seem like they were generic radio ads, almost like blaring at you from some of these podcasts. So what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes, and we'll take your questions in about a half an hour, is to talk about a little bit about what happened, but more about what are we going to do now. And I've invited 2 people onto the stage who not just adapt to change, but actually, or so they've said, actually love change. Actually love the opportunity to do new things. And so that's what we're going to try and focus on today in terms of ads and marketing and where we are now and what we should do next. So I want to welcome Amanda McLaughlin. She is the CEO of Multitude, a podcast collective and sales provider and production house, and one of the hosts of Spirits, a tipsy, I think that's the word I wrote, a tipsy exploration of myth and stories. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
And Lauren Purcell is the founder of Tink Media, named after Tinkerbell, and an expert in podcast marketing and PR. She had a podcast at one point, but we don't talk about that, right? We talk about your newsletter now, which is a podcast, the newsletter, a second one.
Yes. The podcast was called Podcast, but please don't try to find it.
Okay. We will all try and find that. Podcast, the newsletter, and podcasting, marketing, what's the
Podcast marketing magic. We can make marketing fun, I promise.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say before we start to go into new things that are working in podcasting, how did you personally experience the last year? Like what changed for your versions of the business, both in ad sales and production and in marketing? Why don't you start, Lauren?
Me. Gosh, how did things change on my end? I mean, podcast marketing and PR, I think it's a maybe gross words to a lot of people in audio. They're afraid of it. No one wants to do it. My team is having a lot of fun doing it, and our business is doing really well because I don't think there's a lot of people that are specializing in this. And so if I had advice for people just in thinking about podcasting, it's, a lot of people are flocking to what a lot of people are already doing. And I think Amanda and I both kind of flocked to what nobody was doing. And I think that really helped me anyway. So, I've had to hire people. We're still turning down business all the time. So if you have any interest in PR marketing, I think that's a space that's really needed in podcasting. I think personally, we need people writing about podcasts more. That's something else that I do. I don't think I can't pitch just myself. I have a newsletter and I write for Lifehacker. I need other people to be able to pitch to. I think that's an interesting place to get into, but really I think we've gotten more and more clients. We've gotten bigger shows as clients, but we've just had to kind of, diversify the ways we're treating each client. I would never, ever, if anyone ever said, there's this one thing that you should do as a podcaster to grow your show, I would say they're lying or they just don't know what they're talking about. Every single show is different. So I think we've had to take a closer look at the audience, understanding the audience a little bit better, and really think about what would make that show work. It's less and less, it's more and more bespoke.
Well, this is a great time to look at your show and what works
Yes.
and what doesn't. All right, Amanda, how has the last year been?
It's been a great year for Multitude. We added people. We just returned from a 7-city live show tour with our mythology and Dungeons and Dragons podcasts. And it's incredible. Like there have never been more people listening to podcasts, making them part of their lives and commutes and worlds. And I would say the big changes and headlines that we've seen and read about ad sales, about layoffs, about these kind of industry-wide trends being kind of like secularly falling is more to do with mismanagement at the executive level than it is with the reality on the ground. Like there was more money spent. Yeah, there was more money spent last year in podcast ad sales than the year before and the year before that. And I think the difference is that the kind of like bloated, dumb mistakes and bets that people took with venture capital money in the sort of post-Gimlet boom, those bets are coming due. And the rest of us who have been quietly, sustainably making a living as independent podcasters, as small businesses, as independent, companies, have an exciting road ahead of us.
I think it's definitely true that big companies have had problems and shows that had huge staff and overspending and maybe didn't quite know who their audience was or what they were doing. But small shows have also struggled and found it more difficult to grow listenership, more difficult to get ads, maybe feeling like the amount that they're getting per ad is going down. So what are you hearing from the small independent podcasts that you serve?
I am seeing more people need to think critically about the tools available to them in terms of making money and ad sales in podcasting. For example, 5 years ago, we did not use dynamic ads, those kinds where they're like, let's cut to commercial, and then it drops in, a radio style ad. They can be very annoying, but the technology has come a long way where they can also be a good way to earn more money and drop in, let's say, a host read ad that I read myself. And when you get creative and thoughtful about how you use those tools and not just say like, we'll just turn things on, or we're not going to make any money at all because that's selling out. We don't have the luxury of making that choice. And so we get to think critically and use those tools in a way that makes money for us and respects our listeners' time and attention. So I think it requires planning. It requires being a business owner. And I think any podcaster, any creator who is making a podcast and wants to earn some kind of living from it, even if it's just breaking even on the cost of making that podcast, does need to think of themselves as a business owner and to think about how to use those tools, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and more importantly, their audience.
Well, let's quickly talk about something that's in the title of this particular session, the tyranny of the CPM. So CPM stands for
Cost per meal.
I wanted you to do the Latin part.
Yes. I confidently say it because no one speaks that language anymore.
It's the worst. Like the thing that is at the very center of making money for podcasts involves Latin. And you have to every single time say CPM is cost per meal. Meal is 1,000. So CPM means cost per 1,000. So cost per 1,000 people who hear your ad.
Does academia like using Latin for no reason? Is that a thing you guys do a lot?
I don't know who came up with this. The Romans, apparently. But I know. And so basically whatever your podcast is, there is a amount of money that you charge per listener, per 1,000 listeners. Last year, I think Libsyn said the average was $22. So that's $22. It would cost someone who wants to take on an ad on a podcast for 1,000 listeners. That's like 2 pennies per listener.
Better than YouTube, but not the value of your work, I would say.
Not the value of your work. So the reason why this has worked for a long time, because a CPM, of course, came before podcasting. It was in radio, it was in TV. It was just the way that you paid for advertising was how many listeners, how many viewers, how many eyes, how many ears. I'm going to pay you per ear, per pair of ears, I guess, per pair of 1,000 ears, 2,000 ears, 1,000 listeners. But the part that becomes the tyranny is that it means that the thing that matters and almost exclusively matters sometimes for your podcast is how many people are downloading it and listening. Is that a problem? And do we need to think about it differently?
I think it is one of those things that's a unavoidable reality that to some extent, when you are making media, the size of your audience does matter. But we are really fortunate here in audio and in podcasting in that podcast listeners show up like nobody else. Podcast listeners are showing up to listen to you, to get your opinion, and to be referred to do things, whether it's to take action on behalf of an organization that you are trying to bring attention to, or to buy, the brand of shampoo I use. And that ultimately, that's the basis of all advertising is you take a trusted source and ask that source to rent out some portion of their credibility, their voice, their time to recommend a service to a listener. And CPMs are higher in podcasting than any other medium. And
good news.
Podcast listeners show up and convert stronger than any other medium, which is why, again, I'm fundamentally optimistic. I'm in a great business for a medium that depends on, again, my word of my recommendation meaning something and making some money from it. So while CPMs are not quite as high as they were 5 years ago, they're still much higher than they are in video, than they are in other kinds of mediums as well. And so that makes me feel really strong. It's not the only solution. We also make money in lots of different ways, from touring, from Patreon, from direct listener support. All of those are really important to keep in mind. And it's also important not to alienate your listenership by packing it full of terrible ads and making up in quantity, what you wish you are sacrificing in quality. So I'm happy to get into details of how that all works, but the money is still there, and it's a heck of a lot easier and more powerful to make a living with an audience of podcasters than it is newsletter subscribers, YouTube watchers, or followers on Spotify.
We will get into that, but I wanted to have Lauren talk about how do you figure out who your listeners are, what your unique value proposition, as we say in the business is.
Yeah, I think none of podcasters do surveys. I think surveys are really, really good. There's some unique questions you can ask to find out things about your show. Actually, I always want to know what other shows do you listen to, and what newsletters do you read, like that kind of stuff. But I also think that the way that I think about it is borrowing from audiences. I think that that's the best way to grow. So when I get a client, I think, okay, who are their podcast friends? This is very cheesy. You can think of it in any way you want, but where is the audience match? And once you find that audience match, I think working with that audience in a creative way is the best way to grow. And audience match, I think it's really interesting that we have you here, because I've talked about this with you before. An audience match isn't necessarily a genre match. Multitude shows are not the same topic on every single show. It's a vibe match. And so when you listen to a multitude show, you feel multitudey. And I think that that's a really good way to grow. But I think when it comes to money, I think we need to stop obsessing over downloads so much. I wish we lived in a world where we could stop obsessing over downloads. A lot of times when I get a new client, I'm like, well, what is, they come wanting more downloads. And I'm like, well, what is your real goal? Like, take a step back. And sometimes they say, I've never thought about that before, or no one has ever asked me that before. Really, what is your goal? I've had a client who had a small business and they just wanted more clients. Downloads they didn't need tons of downloads, you know? I hear this rumor all the time that you need 10,000 downloads to make money. That's not true. That's if you want to get maybe picked up by a big network. There's really creative ways to make money that don't necessarily have tons to do with download numbers. If you can prove your worth and your valuable audiences will do a lot of things. I had a client who was Southern Food Podcast sponsored by her local car dealership. She sold 12 cars. And when she went on tour with her podcast, they let her take one of the cars to go around on tour. Who would have ever thought? And it worked because her listeners liked her and they were doing what, you know, she had to say. So I think that there's all sorts of things. I think brand, you know, if I was trying to get money for a podcast, I would think of a brand match and say, would you like to sponsor one episode, a season, you know, 3 episodes, a mini series or something like that, because you can add value to those ads more than just a 30-second ad. Maybe you can incorporate the thing that you're advertising into your podcast or something. I just think diversifying the way that you're looking for money, the way you're looking for listeners, the way you're finding audiences, and getting to know your show and thinking really creatively will help you like in every single way you can imagine.
Lauren, you've just given more like concrete, interesting sales advice to podcasters in the room than any podcast ad sales executive I have ever spoken with. Which is to say, you're smart. And also many of those executives are really bad at their jobs. And, you know, I'm sitting here like my title is also CEO. So like, I get it, but like almost everybody who has a like 6-figure executive job in podcasting came from either legacy media, where they, you know, cut their teeth working at NBC or wherever, these big companies in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Great legacy media, some things apply, or they're venture capitalists who don't know jack shit, sorry, about media. And they want to like 10x their returns to end up, you know, making someone millions of dollars. And then they'll look at something like Gimlet and say, not doing enough for me. And that's like incredible and inconceivable to anyone in this room. And I think it's really important to know that like you, as the person who gets to know your clients' audiences, and moreover, your clients who are like sitting here every day, reading the Instagram direct messages, reading the emails, seeing the comments from listeners on their shows, they know their shows the best. And they are the ones who can, like my colleague and husband Eric did for Get Our First Sponsor, walk into a game store that we went to all the time and say, hey, I'm starting a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. You know my face because I'm here all the time. Give me $50 per episode. Let's see where this goes. And 7 years later, they're still one of our best sponsors. And we do all kinds of work with them. So it's important to know and to own your value and say, no, I know my audience listens and I know who they are. And I can walk in and make that face-to-face or over the phone or good cold email connection and say, I got something special here. Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
This is actually pretty revolutionary for an ad panel, and I've been to many of them at podcast conferences, because what you both seem to be saying is that podcasts are made by unique humans with unique values they're putting out there, speaking to other humans in the audience. And then when you go into the sales thing, they're not just numbers. You're talking to humans who want to sell something that they love to other people who might love the product.
Yeah. And I think the doomsaying in our industry, or that you read in headlines, is because, again, it's very difficult to like, I'm not going to become a podcast millionaire. Okay. I'm not going to have my like Hamptons home because I'm here like selling ads on 30 podcasts and helping 30 podcasters make a medium-sized living. But that's what I want to do. And that is success to me. Like, I wouldn't trade places, I think, with anybody else whose, you know, jobs I see or business cards are like fancier than mine. But I think that is the sustainable way. That is the future. I am very bullish on the long-term sort of prospects of running a like member supported or Patreon based or partially ad supported business. It's never been easier, or you've never had more tools, I should say, to make a living as an independent content creator. And I think teaming up with people who get it, who get your value, who get why you do this and why your audience matters is the way. Like, it's so clear that you love podcasting, you know why you're here, you know how to help people grow their audiences. And I just like, if I could do one thing, I would love to like just ask why people are treating podcasts like an embarrassing little throwaway thing that, we're annoyed and need to like explain to our parents what a podcast actually is. This is not 10 years ago. That's not what's happening. Like this is a medium. People can make a living in it. And we have things, I think, to show the establishment in a way that, those from outside the like, I don't know, public media establishment is not necessarily being asked to give, but I'm glad to be here now.
Excellent. I think this is good. And I think we should go through, because both of you have hinted at specifics and we want to hear more specifics. So why don't we kind of think of a sort of podcast makeover, if you will, that we do. We start to think about changing the content and my marketing and the way I do ads and the things beyond ads, right? So let's just pick, I mean, there's probably some people in here who might want to start a podcast, but let's just pick one that's maybe been going for a couple years, has, let's say 5,000 listeners. It's sort of plateaued. I know a lot of podcasters who sort of felt that initial rush of everything happening. And then it just kind of felt like, yeah, I have my listeners and they're not really growing and they sometimes go away. And everything sort of feels plateauy and stale. So let's start. Let's start with the product itself. I do this podcast because I love the thing I'm covering. I love to talk about it. How should I start to think, toward making money off of it and marketing this better, changing the actual content itself?
I would say so as a podcaster, as a person who makes a living doing this, my job is not making a podcast. It's finding, growing, and earning the attention and time of the people who listen to my show. That is how, if you are again in the trying to make money off of this, you need to convince people that it's worth their time to spend their time with you. And so I would ask a podcaster, or I would ask myself, if I'm starting a new show, like, why would someone spend time with me? And that's where we get to all the questions about, what is your unique angle or approach or style, or like why the show, why the subject, why now? Are you earning the attention of the people who you want to spend it with you each episode? And I would say that if your enthusiasm as the creator is flagging, like, people are smart. They pick up on it. Like, you guys have all seen like cringy brand tweets, right? Of like a brand being like, "What's up, bestie?" Like it's terrible. And you're savvy. You get it. And so do listeners. They can hear if you're not having a good time. They can hear if your heart's not in it anymore. And so making sure that first and foremost, you're enthusiastic about it and you have a sense of what kind of like emotion or experience you're trying to evoke in the listener, right? Like, I have a show about mythology and folklore. I am the novice in the room and I come to it with a sense of wonderment of like, it's amazing that people have been telling these stories for thousands of years. And, that's why this goddess or this urban legend or whatever is still around. Like, it motivates me. It fascinates me. I'm there week in and week out. And the format of the show has changed significantly in the 8 years that we've been doing it to keep us interested and to keep the audience interested too. So that's where I'd start.
So keep your interest, think about your audience. Lauren, how do I even know what the audience wants? It's always great to be like, you gotta have your image in your mind of your average listener and what are their problems and how are you solving that? But how do you actually figure out what that is?
I mean, I mentioned before a survey. I feel like ask them, because even if you make a survey and 5 people answer, that's not nothing. And it's your 5 super fans probably. So I would take into account any feedback that you get. And, I hope I'm not straying too far from what you're asking me, but social media, I think, is great for learning about what people think about your show. And I actually don't think it's the best way to grow a show generally, almost always actually. But learning, I'm obsessed with podcast Reddit. I don't know if I'm inviting anyone to join me on podcast Reddit. It is my guilty pleasure. People on podcast Reddit don't just write a tweet or emoji. They write paragraphs about their strong beliefs about your show. And if you're a podcast host sitting here, maybe there's a subreddit about you and you will learn what people have to say. So I think just asking them, but also staying true to keep on having fun and doing what you're doing.
Yeah. And Amanda, you've said this a lot about when it comes to the actual advertising. This is I have a broadcast mind and it takes me sometimes to get into podcast mind. Broadcast mind is all about numbers. I send it out. Yeah, send a letter. We'll read it maybe. But podcast mind is recognizing not just that your listeners are human and they have wants and needs, but that they actually want to help you. Like they They want to answer surveys. They want to help you get money.
Exactly. Like when we ran our first ad in 2015 or 16, I was afraid that I would get I'm showing my, like, I came of age in the blogging era. And I was like, people are going to call me a sellout. They're going to be so annoyed. And people were like, oh my God, you got an ad. I'm so proud of you. Like, you guys are growing up. Like they were so excited for us. And people, again, they're savvy, they're smart, they get it. Like they know that it takes money somewhere to make the thing that they like online. I think in the way that a lot of us supported our local small businesses or restaurants during early lockdown, I bought gift cards and t-shirts for my favorite restaurants because they couldn't be open right then. I knew that, like many of us, that we had to support with our dollars the thing that we like, or else it wouldn't be around anymore. People know. Like, I think media literacy in many ways is like higher than it's ever been. I saw the, lab we walked by on our way in. And it's really, really important that, you pay that back, and that you pay attention to what it is that they're, and kind of give back that investment that they are giving in you. And so when you say to them, fill out this survey because it'll help us know who to approach for ads, or we ask folks in our survey every single summer, what sponsors would you be excited to see on the show? They give us great input. And that means I can go to that sponsor and not just say, oh, hi, t-shirt brand, I heard you advertised on that podcast, so please come on mine. I get to say a screenshot of this listener saying, I'm obsessed with these t-shirts and you guys would look great in them and you should reach out to this sponsor. I can have in my ad deck not just the statistics about, gender, age, location, download numbers, but also the tweets and the word cloud of, I ask people to describe their vibe. And I get all kinds of exciting words that I can use then to make an actually good match with the sponsor. I think my most controversial opinion maybe is that advertising can be mutually beneficial. It can be really good. The business gets in front of people that they want to get in front of, and listeners say oh my God, this is perfect for a gift for my spouse, or I love this thing, or my pet's obsessed with this litter. Even it can be the best of both worlds. And it takes knowing who you are and knowing how to show that to the brand, and the brand knowing what the hell a podcast is and wanting to spend money on it, which again, we're eons ahead of where we were 10 years ago.
But I would say this starts with you stepping back and crafting this audience that loves multitude. If they didn't love multitude, they wouldn't. So it goes all the way back to really starting from scratch and catering to them, listening to them, nurturing them, making them feel part of a community. All that stuff I think you couldn't just do that with any show. So.
And to your question, Robert, they like to help. And so it's a Dale Carnegie maxim, and it's also true in reality on the internet. You ask people to help you, they feel invested in your success.
Also, people will do almost anything for the chance to win a $25 Amazon gift card.
Or to get their name read on the show. One of our Patreon tiers is just your name is read on the show.
I would do anything to have my name. I mean, I'm that girl that's calling in and
Yes.
blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Well, we will get to the Patreon in just a moment, but I love this, that you could just directly tell your audience, you're not a CPM to me.
No,
I care about you. And I love this. I love this trick of going to an advertiser and being hey, it wasn't my idea. The listeners demand it.
they do.
And
And the brand says, oh my God, I'm so flattered. And then they actually have the conversation with you.
So we have this podcast. We're doing the makeover. We've now done the hard work of understanding our audience, understanding ourselves, our value proposition, all of this. Now they're going to come to you, Lauren, and say, all right, let's get this 5,000 number up to 10,000. Go.
I love this question.
Do it. Do it.
Okay. I mean,
Advertising, tweet storm.
Well, one thing that's interesting that's happened very recently, sometimes clients come to me and say, I want to spend this much money. Where should I spend it? And I usually have a list of places to spend money. And I still think if you have money, there's really, really great places to spend it. But I think what we're starting to see is they're more and more scammy. We are finding cracks in, a lot of the ways that people use to spend money on advertising and podcasting. And what actually is proving to be more and more efficient is organic marketing, which is what takes a lot of time and work. And that is why it's harder. It takes a very long time, but it works. And it might not give you a spike like buying an advertisement does, but it'll get you slow organic growth, which means people are telling their friends about you, which is the best way to recommend a podcast. And people are becoming their biggest advocates and returning to you again and again. And that takes a long time. So that's the kind of growth that I want. I don't want a spike that gets in front of the wrong people and comes back down. I want, the kind that I'm willing to, if I have a podcast that I love, I'm going to spend a lot of time on it. And I want, to put a lot of effort and 50% maybe into marketing it. And what I do, I kind of mentioned this before, I find my audience matches. There's a lot of ways to do this.
You're like a walking matchmaker. I've seen you do this. Someone mentions a podcast, and you're like, here are 5 podcasts with the exact same audience or similar.
Yeah, I mean, one tip is just find your show or a show similar to yours and go to the bottom of a podcast app like Apple Podcasts and it'll say shows similar to this. Write down this website, raphonic.com/graph. They're not paying me, but I should get a tattooed on my arm because it's a really fun graph that shows you audience matches. Now, once you find an audience match, I spent most of my job doing this because I feel like once you find the right audience match, a show that is your podcast friend that shares values with you and a vibe and a message, you can find a way to work with these people. And it's all just about borrowing audiences. That is what I would focus on. And I could talk about this for 10 hours and I won't. But the other thing I would do is I would maybe consider your social media strategy. I have found that most podcasters put a little too much into social media, thinking it drives to downloads. And it doesn't, almost always. And there's a few responses I get when I tell people this. They're either like, oh, thank goodness. And to me, that means it's somebody that doesn't want to be on social media. They want to be spending their time making a good podcast. And they were on social media because they felt like they had to. And if you love social media, be on social media. But if you don't. But the other responses that I get is, that's not true. I get a lot of likes on my tweets. And I'm like, sir, congratulations. You have nice friends who are go girling your tweets. That doesn't mean they're listening. Doesn't mean they're downloading, doesn't mean they're new. And then finally someone will say, but my TikTok went viral. And I'm like, prove to me that those are downloads. If your goal is to have a large.
Put it in Hot Pot a few weeks ago that someone had, I think you were
Yes.
quoted in the piece of like or someone from Planet Money, at least, of the difference between the number of TikTok views, and you can get millions and millions of views on TikTok. And I think the podcast got something like 5,000 downloads a week, which is nothing to sniff at, but it's not millions and millions.
And if you want to be on a great TikTok presence, that's great. But that goes back to what are your goals?
Yeah.
So
The TikTok app does not want you to leave TikTok. And so
So once you find your friends, what do you do with them? You just swap promos with each other? Is that
you
that's
can
the
swap
lead?
promos, you can swap guests, you can say, should we be guests on each other's podcasts? One of my favorite things to get really creative with is feed swaps, which means you put an episode of one show into the episode of another show. These are done poorly, but they're also done really well. There was an episode of Search Engine recently that basically PJ Vogt said, you know what? We really wanted to do an episode on this topic, but we found that someone already did a really good one. And so we're just going to put that on our feed instead. And they kind of incorporated they made it feel really natural and normal. And the other thing is with promo swaps, which means you're doing a 30-second ad read on each other's shows. That's an advertisement. Okay. Usually when I set those up, people want to go number for number. It's an ad. So if I have 10,000 downloads and you have 10,000 downloads an episode, we'd each do it, make it even. If you get double, you do two, we make it even number wise, download wise. With the feed swaps, where I'm putting an entire episode of your show into my feed and vice versa, that's not an advertisement. So I can go after shows much larger than me because I'm delivering a piece of wonderful content. Maybe I have this special episode that I've been like, you know what? I know your listeners would love this. Are you taking a week off in the summer? Like maybe go after them during the holiday, maybe, and I find that I can go after shows larger because it doesn't feel like an advertisement. And then I would maybe even say, I found this episode in your archive and it's perfect for my feed and it's going to drive listeners to your show. So if I do that work up front in a feed swap, I can go after shows a little bit bigger than mine. So, and I like getting creative with these. Like maybe I put a episode of your show into my feed and I give you promos in exchange. Like that's what I mean when I say, if you find the right audience, that's what's important. Then you figure out how to work together. Even if one person gets a little bit more than the other, those are still really valuable listeners and you just need to borrow from each other somehow. You can figure it out.
I would add also ask your audience, say to your audience, hey, the only way podcasts grow is when you make your friends listen to podcasts. And if you're on a date, if you're at a study group, if you're on a road trip, make your friend listen to my podcast. And it works. And we have people showing up saying, yeah, my friend forced this on my phone. And now, here I am. Not like you two with that album, but like with context saying to people like, this is a good thing to do. Because again, your listeners are evangelists for your show. If they love it, if they find something of themselves in it, if they get a feeling of relaxation or affirmation or learning from your show each week, they also want to share that with your friend. It's like recommending a great new restaurant you found. And so asking your audience to do that, talking to them about why it's important and actually shouting out and thanking them when it happens is the only way that we have grown our shows and the only way I recommend others do it too.
I would specifically ask your listeners to text it to a friend because
I say pause the pod right
Yes.
now and text somebody fearspodcast.com and tell them text your friend who loves tarot and thinks about death too much.
Yeah.
And that's a compelling statement.
And,
right?
and if you just say, tell them, that's not specific enough. Texting, they have their phone. Their friend has their phone. The phone has the link. Say text.
Yeah.
I love this. I love this. So, so at the time we have left, so now we have a show where we understand our audience. They understand us. We're in a slow, organic way, building our audience up with really strong listeners, not just a burst of random drive-by CPMs. We're going to just toss them off as CPMs now. We're talking about real, true fans we're building. Now, let's talk about getting those ads. Now, in the old days, you just like try and get it above 50,000 downloads. You go to some big company that takes 30% and just be like, do it for me.
I think those companies are not selling ads for anyone right now. Like the idea that somebody's podcast gets 50,000 downloads and someone has not sold one ad on their podcast, like what are they doing wrong? And so I would say if you are in that position or know someone who's in that position, that podcaster should talk to the ad sales company or talk to the network and be like, what are you doing for me exactly? And I think as creative people or as podcast creators, we are told that like we should just be like pat on the head and be grateful for any money we get, right? That like we should just be grateful to have a job or be grateful to like be working in media or be grateful to like have the podcast out there and, be happy with what you've got. And that is absolute bullshit. Like the network only makes money because of the work you do. The ad sales companies take commission on ads they sell on your show because your listeners care about your voice and the advertisers want to rent your, integrity to sell their product. And so I would say that, compare notes with your coworkers, talk to your agency or your network and say like, what exactly is going on here? Because the money is there for the taking. I have more podcast advertisers asking to buy on shows than I have shows to put those advertisements on. So like talk to me, talk to somebody else, but like that's just not true. And I think to your point at the beginning of the panel, the money is being differently distributed. And it's not like there are, 100 podcasts out there that you can advertise on. And so it's really easy to get the money spent on those places. It is a little bit harder, but the money is there for the taking. So I would say, yeah, compare notes, be an advocate for yourself. And if you don't know who to talk to, come talk to me.
So you mentioned the tip about having your listeners suggest places
Yes.
to go to or go to your corner store, that sort of thing. Slightly bigger companies beyond that, where can I find advertisers? Can I call up Ford?
You should email any company that advertises on other podcasts. If they buy ads on other podcasts, they buy podcast ads. And so you can write in and say, hey, I'm this podcast. These are my numbers. This is my deck. This is my email. Let me reach out and do it. That's also very labor intensive. So you should also find an ad sales representative that understands you and your show and can do a good job talking, not just, oh, I have a couple shows with 100,000 downloads each, but this is exactly why, I like your audience for this brand right now.
Amanda on Multitude's site has a great template for the kind of thing you can send to an advertiser, which goes into detail on all the things that they want to see in one place. But just give me one thing. Like I'm cold emailing 20 different people I think might advertise. Like, what's the number one thing I have to communicate to them? Besides my new expanded listenership, but like, how do I connect with them?
I think that they'll vary a little bit based on who you are, but mine is my listeners are begging me to get you on the show. They're obsessed with you, Canva. Canva, please. Canva, we use you every day. Canva, please come on the show. We love you. And I know who my audience are. I know that they're, creative professionals in their late 20s who have been tasked with like making the marketing assets for their job. And so like Canva, they need you. And like, let me tell them about you. And moreover, it's just a sense that like, I'm a professional. I know what I'm doing. I make excellent host read ads that sound like content. And I am going to make an ad that you're going to be proud of. And you, marketing person, will impress your boss by spending money with me.
I love that both of you are saying that you need to tell more people I need you. Which is great, right? Because everyone wants to feel needed. If you're sitting in Canva's corporate headquarters, wherever that may be,
Australia, baby.
Australia, counting just
Canva's my white whale.
Just looking at graphs of listeners and demographics and everything. Probably one email that just says I love you is just would make
And listen,
make their day.
That's our thing. That's our difference. Like our homepage says, Multitude shows have gotten tens of millions of downloads, whatever, and more than a few logo tattoos. People have gotten our logos of our podcasts tattooed on their body. And so that's the attitude we're approaching this with of like, nobody's going to love this harder and more extreme than we are and our audience is. And that, that sense and that feeling and how you market yourself is going to vary person to person, podcast to podcast. But we know who we are, and we think that it would be smart of you to work with us. And so that's, in a polite way, the thing that you want to convey.
We will take questions in just a couple of minutes, but the previous panel they talked a little bit about Patreon at a high level, which sounds great, right? Everyone knows Patreon. This is a place where you can sign up and then your listeners can pay you money every month. Like, it sounds easy, but then once you get into it, you start to struggle with, well, oh, how do I convince people? What am I going to give them? Do I have to do like 10 extra episodes a year just to give to them? And I don't have a staff to do that. Maybe you could just quickly talk about how you could work Patreon to your advantage as a small podcast where you don't have a lot of extra staff.
Yeah, I think no matter the size of your show, you can approach it with strategy and good forethought like anybody else. We published a great article on Multitude.productions, all by Eric in the back of the room. You can say hi to him, all about how to do Patreon well. You can do a Patreon, or someone, please, I beg you, make a Patreon competitor. So there's not just one company dominating this whole thing. But I think it would be a really good idea to do something like, hey, cost money to make this. If you give me $5 or $25 a month, thank you. And that can be it. You don't have to give a reward. You don't have to model what everybody else is doing or saying. Or you can say, hey, we have, notes and preparation, and I read 2 books for this podcast because I'm Michael Hobbs and I'm crazy in a wonderful way. And so then if he wants to share his research notes from the episode, that's a byproduct of the episode you already have. You have bloopers, right? You have the full tape of an interview you did when only 3 minutes of the 30 minutes made it onto the show. And you can decide on the things that work for you and express them with enthusiasm to the audience and say, I'm so excited to offer you this thing, and start a little less ambitious than you think you can do and build it over time. And hey, if 6 months or a year from now, you're like, you know what, I thought of something even better, or I see this other podcast doing something and I love it, or I thought I would love doing video episodes and I hate that so much, then you get to say to your audience, wow, have I learned? And now I'm going to offer you this, and anyone who can support me, thank you. And just express it with the, excitement, enthusiasm that you want your audience to feel, and they'll model it back to you.
I also think something, you don't always have to give them something extra. That's great. But I've even seen podcasts saying, if you're a Patreon subscriber, you can ask questions that will get read on the podcast, or you can help decide which episodes are coming next. You can punch up the jam with this old show. You could vote for the song that they would cover. So I feel like even just asking for their input, if you have listeners that love you enough, they would love to be part of that conversation. So, and also I just want to say, I have clients that love Patreon and hate it. I think there's not one right answer. It's just like, you have to think about your audience and what you're willing to do.
This sounds like you got to generate a lot of enthusiasm a lot of the time. Enthusiastic to your audience, to your Patreon subscribers, to the advertisers, just nonstop enthusiasm.
It's not fake though. And it's like, I feel extremely lucky that I get to make a living making a podcast and not working at JP Morgan anymore. Like that feels great. And the people, like, our mission is to be able to build community around subjects that we really care about. And in our case at Multitude, especially when people think that those subjects are, stupid or not worth getting into, or you need to like have a mathematics degree to play Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it might be. And we have an actual astrophysicist for that, Columbia grad. But she is great. And like the people we work with, it's a dream to get to do this every day. And the people who support us know that they are helping us do our dream every day. And whenever we plug Patreon on the show, we get to say, hey, the fact that this is my job is because you support me on Patreon and listen to the ads and like do the things that I ask you to do. And people are excited to support that. It would feel very exhausting if we forced it, but we don't have to. And I think a big part of that is because we get to do this on exactly our terms in the way that we want to. And it's taken, 8 years to get to this point. But we are so excited and passionate about like telling other people that like they can do it too. And you don't need someone who used to work at like Viacom telling you that the thing you do is worth him making money maybe at some point in the future in order for it to be worth you doing. Maybe it's spite, but that's what motivates me.
And that feeds into something. I mean, clients, this year, it's been rough. It's been a rough couple of years in podcasting, and my clients are like, should I be worried? And I always tell my indie clients, you should not be worried, because you're doing this for the right reason. You love it. You're always doing it. You weren't spending tons of money that you didn't have. Like you were doing it from your heart the whole way along, the whole way, like, I think that that's why the indies are in great shape. So for the same reason, because you're going to have the enthusiasm because you wanted to do it in the first place. That's why you were doing it. You weren't doing it to make money. So I think in the long run, you're going to be better off.
All right. Human beings and enthusiasm are going to win. Let's take a couple of questions. I don't know if there's an audience mic or if my mic is the audience mic. Oh, excellent.
I don't have a question.
No, oh, I understand. That was a, well, okay, we have a question here.
Hi, my name is Abukar. I'm a producer at Campside Media, and I think like a lot of people in this industry, I am struck by the discrepancy between, ads or sales are going up and, there are a lot of listeners, more listeners than ever, and seeing people around me getting laid off, entire shops shutting down. And so I have a two-part question. One is, and also like hear your point about like one, mismanagement, and two, maybe shifting your expectations about like what you can make in this industry. But my question is, the first one is, is the industry, I mean, how do I say this? So is the industry kind of saturated a bit where it's harder to get audience in a way that obviously when I started back in 2019, 18, 17, it wasn't as difficult? And the second part of my question is, how much of what you're saying applies to the limited series narrative, and in particular, investigative shows, the kinds that we make that aren't really that cheap to make to begin with? And so how much of your advice actually applies to what I'm doing?
Excellent questions. So one of the shows that I sell ads for is Drilled by Amy Westervelt. And it's a true crime show about climate change. And it's a deeply reported, very expensive to make podcast about, she has like FOIA requests into Exxon and like breaks real news about how these companies are, treating the planet and each other. And that is a seasonal show. The ads are close to sold out. She does a great job between membership and ad sales, implying all of the things that we're talking about today. She is in, I think, like her 10th season or 11th season of making like incredible investigative reporting. I think something that led our industry astray exactly 10 years ago this month was the launch of Serial. I want to just like remind us of a couple things of like Serial was made by people who were on payroll at This American Life for 2+ years, I think. It launched on the feed of This American Life, at the time the largest podcast in the world. And yes, it was incredibly successful. But I think the lesson a lot of people took away from that is that, oh, all I have to do is make a 10-episode limited series, right? Like expensive, highly beautiful, like well done series in order to like make something that's going to make a lot of money and like get the MailChimp deal. And it's incredibly hard to make money on a limited series when you are launching it to a brand new audience from a maker or a feed that nobody's heard of. And so Amy on Drilled gets creative by doing things like, running a bonus every few weeks, or doing something where she answers listener questions. She has other shows with similar feeds where she'll like promote and drop new things. A lot of the lessons that, we were talking about earlier with cross promotion, all of those are really interesting and really worthwhile. I think that overall, the idea that like you can just like make something like Serial and it'll all work out and the economics will work, that's the thing that I don't necessarily feel is sustainable or can move forward.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. How do you set a price for your ads if you don't do CPMs? How do you, like, what are the fees for, I mean, not what are specifically the numbers, but how do you set a price for the value that you add to that you sell at?
Yeah, so we use CPMs for some shows. They're just higher because I can justify why it's worth paying more money for someone to, write a unique ad, knowing the audience really well, an audience that's very specific. For example, everyone who listens to Drilled cares really deeply about the environmental impact of the companies we're talking about.
So you'll say, if someone's like, oh, well, everybody's just paying $22 a CPM, you'll say,
I'll say, okay, great. Enjoy. Like, go ahead. And ultimately they'll want to
you
come
want the
back.
good stuff.
Yeah, with somebody who's good to work with and I know will have impact. I also do things like reward the kind of business I want more of. So if folks want to commit to 3 months of ads up front, then I can, give them a discount. And I'm using quotes because, maybe the price I go out with is a little bit higher than I actually need. And then I bring it down if they commit to, more than 3 or 4 ads in a row. Others, we do flat rates and say, like, this is the flat rate for this podcast. This is the rate for a sponsored segment brought to you by a local real estate agent for this podcast that covers a local football team, whatever it might be. But trying to get creative about bringing back long-term repeat business, because that's where we really shine and we can show our creativity.
Another question?
Hi, I'm Paul. I actually work for Columbia University, not for the journalism school, but I do a podcast, and I was just wondering if we wanted to continue to grow the audience, like we're not necessarily interested in making money off of it, but just sharing. It's a career podcast, so we're just like sharing lessons from people who have been successful in their careers. Do you have any advice as far as how I could go about enhancing the audience or getting the word out as far as the marketing? I know you were talking about like looking into similar communities and stuff. So I know who I want the audience to be, but do you have any like best practices on just growing it? We've done a whole bunch of different types of marketing. I'm just curious, and any thoughts there?
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff you can do. I think a lot of times we get clients that want us to pitch them to big media, and we'll always do that. You can pitch. We love podcast newsletters. There's not too many of them, but that's your perfect audience. Anyone nerdy enough to subscribe to a podcast newsletter is looking for new shows. So I would say pitch yourself to podcast newsletters. But you know, it's strange because I feel like I've talked to a lot of people that have been featured in the New York Times or some large publication like that, and they say it didn't do anything. And it goes back to something that I think can drive a lot of advice here in a short amount of time. It's very hard to convert a non-listener into a listener. It's almost impossible. I don't waste my time doing it. I tried to get my mom to listen to podcasts for 5 years before she actually did. Not worth my time, low ROI. Go to where the podcast listeners already are. And that's why podcast newsletters are great. That's why sharing, finding other podcasts, because getting your podcast heard on other podcasts, those are podcast listeners right there. I was speaking once and someone stood up and said, why would I send my listeners to another podcast? And it's like, I was kind of dumbstruck for a second. I think I said, I think you're in the wrong industry, because that's what I love about podcasting. It's all about sharing. And also, most people tend to listen to more than one podcast. As Ariel, I don't know if she's still here, but we always say, yes, people will listen to more than one. I think just worry about your own and feel free to share. You can also pitch yourself to podcast apps. There's usually links that you can pitch yourself to be featured in Apple Podcasts. You can do that. So I feel like figure out where the listeners are and go there. Anyway, it's just a little bit, anything to add to that?
I would just add, be a guest on other podcasts. People come for information, but they stay because they like you. Like if you grew up, watching a late night talk show or like a morning talk show as you get ready for school, like, your mom didn't choose that one because she likes the information better. It's because you vibe with the people and the stories and their lens. And so if you yourself, as a representative of your show, go on someone else's podcast, even if it's about something totally different. I go on like a gardening podcast when most of the time I talk about, mythology or D&D. It's if they like my approach and how I come off and how I talk about subjects, they'll like the other stuff that I'm doing too. So going on other shows, even if it's, one a month or one a quarter, is well worth your time.
It also helps when you're covering a bunch of, as podcasters, you often go into many different communities. You're telling different people's stories. That's oftentimes a touch point to bring people in. They may just come for one episode because you're talking about motorcycles, and the motorcycle enthusiasts, tune in for that. But a few people will stick around because they like you, they like the topics, they like the podcast. So we've tried to hit that on Planet Money a lot, where we're just entering these communities and make sure that they know that we're doing an episode.
Or what if you interviewed on your show, even if you don't have interviews yet, maybe once a month you interview someone who has a podcast. Okay. Working with podcasters is a really good idea. It's good to interview all sorts of people, but interviewing podcasters and having them on their show, and then maybe later going back to them and saying, hey, you were on my show and it was a really great episode. It was a favorite. Do you mind putting it on your feed? Maybe on Christmas when you weren't going to do an episode, or in the summer or something like that. I would go back, actually, if you have a podcast, through your archive and say, look, who has a podcast? Can I ask them to put it on their feed? That's something that you could do very quickly.
Plus, they have nice microphones. Yeah. They always sound good. We had a question back behind.
Hi, I'm Kim. I work at Prolog Projects now, but I've worked at a lot of other podcast companies and I've done a lot of surveys of audiences. And sometimes I've come back with like completely useless information. So I wanted to ask, like, what are your top 3 survey questions? Like, what do you listen to? Obviously, what other podcasts do you listen to? But like, what are the kind of questions that people aren't asking their audiences that maybe should be included in those surveys?
Oh, what a good question. Multi-job productions. We have an example of our survey, how to make an audience survey, questions we like to ask. My favorites recently are, how would you describe this show to a friend? Because I am sometimes too close to what it is that I do to describe it well to others. And seeing that, again, word cloud, or seeing those responses of like, oh, this is an element that people love about the show that I didn't know, can be really instructive and clarifying for marketing. That's one I really love. 2, I always ask them again, who would you be excited to see sponsor the show? That's always a really helpful one. And let me think on the 3rd. I'll let you go.
What about, I would ask, should this show be shorter or longer? Don't say, is it too long or is it too short? Because they'll just go, no, it's fine. Is it too short or is it too long? I would also say, if something went away from the show, what would you miss about it? Like if there was a segment or something that was gone, what would you miss about it? And then I guess any more creative question than what other podcasts do you listen to? Maybe like, I would try to test more specific ways to ask that question. Like, what is the last podcast that you listened to twice? What is something like that, where you get something that not just a podcast list of podcasts, but something that they really love, maybe something that they recommended, maybe something that they're regular, maybe what do you subscribe? Do you pay money on Patreon for anything? Something about that.
Yeah, that I love that idea. We also ask people how they found us, just so that we can do some amount of like attribution of like, oh, you heard me on this podcast 6 years ago. That's why you listen to this one now. And then lastly, I also really like to ask what subject they would love to hear us make a show about, from the level of multitude, because we know we can bring our approach to anything, and we want to know like what they would be really excited to hear.
If you Google, there's an article called "What We Talk About When We Talk About Podcasting" by Tom Webster. And it has some great survey idea questions.
We have donuts waiting, so we're going to leave it at that. I would just say to everyone in the room, if you work for a podcaster now, if you're in podcasting, go meet the people who are selling your ads, marketing your program, ask to see the budget for your show, like really like know how the money works. And for those who are students in the room who are applying to places, it never hurts to ask, when they ask, do you have any questions for us? Is ask about their business model, ask where the money is coming from, because we have to normalize talking about this, and everyone down to the production assistant needs to know and be part of what we're talking about here, marketing and sales.
If it's a public company, they have to file their financials every single quarter, every single year, read those 10Ks. They're fascinating. It's the more you know.
Even a nonprofit has the 990s. Yeah.
There you go.
All right. Thank you so much for being up here, and thanks everyone.